Did freaking out and yelling in that person get them to change their opinion? Probably not. Did it get them to help you faster on that project of yours that's so important? No, it probably caused them to go, I'm actually going to put that a few down the list now, It's like when somebody drives up right behind me and, flashes their lights.
Yeah.
I always slow down. I'm like, oh, yeah? What?
Welcome to the Masks Off podcast, Leadership Strategies, No Disguises. I'm Razwana Waheed, and together with my co-host Olivier Larvor, we talk to the smartest people in the world of leadership, change and psychology to give leaders real strategies to bring human back to the workplace.
If you would like to support our show, please subscribe to our channel, like us, or share this episode on your social media. It will help us greatly.
In this episode, we speak to psychologist and business strategist Liane Davey on how actively bringing conflict into the business helps you reach your goals faster.
When I started working in the field of team effectiveness, about 12 years ago, I expected that what I was going to spend most of my time doing was refereeing conflict, trying to reduce the amount of conflict and expecting to have my whistle and my red and yellow card ready. And it turned out that it's much more common for teams to have too little conflict than too much. There's a couple of big costs of insufficient conflict to the business. So first, revenue growth is such a challenge for so many of the organizations that we work with, and innovation and being able to spur new ideas. That doesn't come without conflict, without disagreements, without diversity of thought. So there's a big cost to the top line. But around 2008, we learned that there's a huge cost on the other side to insufficient conflict, which is that if everyone thinks alike, no one thinks very much. And what we saw in 2008 is that a lot of people knew that they were headed over a cliff, but there was insufficient conflict to mitigate risk or to call out risk. The two things that I think we should be really worried about if we don't have enough conflict are, how do we innovate? How do we grow the top line? But also, how do we protect the organization with the kind of bravery and courage it takes to call out risks? So that's what got me many years ago focused on, actually, I'm going to be the one who helps teams have more conflict, which I don't tell them at first.
Yeah, I'm sure you sell
they
well.
won't hire you if you did.
Yes.
I'm going to help you argue loads, guys.
Yeah, exactly. So I've even had people, when I use the word conflict, kind of raise their hands and say, could we use a different word? And I always say, well, yes, you can use a different word, but if you can't even say conflict, it's probably not likely that you can have conflict. So let's just try using the word.
I imagine the faces of the executive, I think there's this culture with ranks, and when you're a leader, you expect everybody to fall in line almost,
Yes.
And whatever you say, well, this is words of wisdom. What can you say to leaders to convince them that they need conflict in their companies, I guess?
I think leaders these days are starting to understand and starting to recognize it.
Yeah.
And senior leaders are actually desperate for someone to disagree, to point something out, to have their back and cover their blind spot. So leaders are starting to figure it out. They can't elicit it from their teams. There's sort of three categories of how people get conflict wrong. There's the people who have never said a nasty word about anyone or disagreed with anyone in their whole lives. And their reaction is, oh my goodness, we have to have conflict. So there's the people who are just conflict averse in general. That's the first category. And they don't like me at all because it's going to be really uncomfortable. The second category are the ones who actually have a ton of conflict. They just are very passive aggressive.
Yeah.
And their issue is they've been caught. We've figured out that they're whispering in the cafeteria, and now we are shining a light on them. And what they're upset about is all these brave things they're willing to say when no one's listening, no one's there. Right. Now they actually have to say them. So that's the second category. And the third category are the people who are just vicious and careless in conflict. And they're completely happy to have conflict. They're just not willing in any way to inhibit themselves, to spend any energy on having conflict in a way that is not hurtful, is not going to create defensiveness or resistance. So that's the challenge. On any given team, you probably have people from each of those different categories. So what you have to convince the leader of is that there is a form of conflict that is both productive for the business, but gentle on the humans. They understand intuitively that they're not going to get the kind of growth they need, and they're not going to get the risk mitigation without conflict. They just cannot visualize a kind of conflict that isn't going to make it worse. You know, what I do is I work very hard on creating an image and a picture in the team leader's mind of what conflict could look like in a way that's very productive. So when we first start working with a team, we start by saying, what's going on in your business environment? Okay, how is the world changing? And how is that changing what your team needs to be for your organization? How is it changing your value to your organization? And once we get through that, we talk about, okay, so if that's the unique value of your team, what's the unique value of each role on the team? One of my favorite ones was working with a very large food manufacturer. This was the executive team, so the CEO and his team. And on this team, you had the head of sales and the head of operations. These two didn't get along all that well. And unfortunately, what happened is they would sort of check their comments because they felt like, oh, I'm not being a good team player or that sort of thing. So what we had to do is paint a new picture. So I said to the head of sales, what are you here to do on this team? What is your most important job? And he was very clear. He said, you know, we have these 4 major supermarkets, grocery chains that are our huge customers. Each of them wants to differentiate, right? They want to be different than the others. We're supplying the food to all 4, but they want something different. So it's my job to use product development to give each something different and unique and something that fits with their brand. And so you could see him telling this story about flexibility. That was great. Okay, good. Now, okay, Mr. Head of Operations, what are you here to do? And he started to smile. He said, well, I'm here to lock everything down, make it consistent, because if it's consistent, it'll be cheaper, it'll be higher quality, we'll have, you know, better use of our capital because these machines are extremely expensive. And if we're having to change out the line for every different packaging or ingredients, or you stop and you go, so how does that feel, guys? And when they can finally say, oh, it's exhausting and it feels, you know, not great. And you can say, and that's what it's supposed to be. On a good day, it feels uncomfortable and it feels like there's a lot of tension. So what we're doing from the get-go is mapping out the business purpose of conflict, the business purpose of those tensions. We're normalizing it. We're saying that's not you being a jerk. And that's not you being a poor team player. That's you doing your job. Because if we said to every single customer, nope, you have to take this one, you know, this is the kind of sausage you can have, the only kind of sausage, there is one sausage.
That will be boring, huh?
Somebody else is going to say to the huge grocery chain, hey, you know, I'm happy to make you, you know, I'm going to put rosemary in your sausage, and off you go. If we don't have that salesperson fighting for product development, differentiation, that sort of thing, the company loses. And if we don't have that operations person saying, no, we cannot have a different sausage for every, you know, maybe we can change the ingredients, but we can't have, you know, 17 different sizes that require 16 different boxes. And so if we didn't have that person, we could sell a lot of sausages and lose a lot of money on every sausage. Trying to normalize conflict from the get-go is really, really important in our method. It's something that, and once you say that, and once you say that you're doing a good job if it feels uncomfortable, they go, oh yeah. Yeah. So that's where we start.
So Liane, you mentioned earlier that you don't necessarily use the word conflict early on because it kind of almost emotionally hijacks people. So when a leader that you're working with finally understands that it's actually healthy conflict, how do you then advise them to start those conversations?
So we start with that conversation I was talking about mapping out for every role on your team, what is the tension that role is supposed to be putting on the team. So we start there. We start in talking about it hypothetically. We start in talking about it generically in terms of the role. That's a lot safer than I think most people hire a team effectiveness consultant and they start in talking about bad behavior in the past. Right. She said this and he was nasty and that's never going to go well. I kind of say it's like playing football and expecting someone to dole out red and yellow cards without knowing what the rules are. Yeah. Right? Yeah. If I go for the ball, that's a tackle and that's okay. And I think in teams, we have to map that out. What's going for the ball in business conflict right. and what's hacking at the ankles and completely not acceptable, right? So we're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to create a rule book separate from talking about individuals' behavior. Then the next thing we're going to do with any team is we actually do some personality assessment work. My partner is a psychologist, works with the folks to understand their own personal perspectives on these sorts of things. So we get a sense of how the different people on the team need to be communicated to differently. So we get a sense of who can have the conflict come at them kind of like a 2x4 straight to the forehead, and who needs it kind of wrapped up in a gift box with a bow. Right. Them very delicately. We get a sense of who on the team needs the issue to be very fact-based and no judgment and nothing emotional around it, and who's the opposite, who actually needs the conversation and the conflict to have an outlet for the emotional side and the more human side. And on any given team, you'll have half that are one that really need things to be kept very sterile and very clinical and very clean. And they'll say things like, let's just take the emotions out of this. Always giggle. So that's where we'll go next. So we start with, defining what's the rule book around what are the conflicts supposed to look like in our team. And then we get a better sense of how the human beings on the team are going to react to conflict differently, how they're going to engage in conflict differently. And then we move to building a skill set. One of my most popular HBR articles ever was called Conflict Strategies for Nice People. It lays out actual techniques of how do I say something that is, in opposition or different to something someone else on my team has said, in a way that aim to have conflict in a way that strengthens the relationship with the other person. Right. If you're having conflict well, they should trust you more afterward. They should value you more afterward. That's a good test. You're having productive conflict if your relationship gets stronger, not weaker. If somebody is resisting your idea, how to use a hypothetical. Okay, I understand we'll never get the suppliers on side. Let's just imagine that we could get the suppliers on side. Or we'll teach them how to use what we call the two truths. When you really think someone's coming from left field, you think what they're saying is not right, and you want to have that, fight of black, white, black, white. How do you instead say, wow, okay, so I hear for you, I don't know if you saw that hilarious internet meme of the dress, and some people saw the dress as white and gold, and some saw it as blue and black. So it's to have the conversation, wow, so for you, the dress is white and gold. Wow, for me, the dress is blue and black. What's going on there, right? And so you can do that in a business conversation equally as much. You can be talking about, okay, so for you, the most important investment is for, greater training of our sales staff. Okay. For me, I think we're way behind on marketing, and I think that investment needs to go into marketing. How do we solve for this? And those are conflict techniques that take you from sitting across the table in opposition to one another to now sitting on the same side of the table looking at a hard problem. Yeah. We have to both, train our sales staff and invest more in marketing. How do we make that work? Is there a way that we could kind of do both at once, or, those sorts of things? So once we get through those sort of setup things of defining what productive conflict is supposed to look like, understanding how the individuals approach it, then we can get into some really the nitty-gritty of the skills. People will say to me, I know I need to say this. Just give me the right words.
Right.
How do I say it so I don't piss her off?
Yeah.
Or give me the right words so that when I say it, the person doesn't A, yell, or B, cry. Yeah. Because God help me if I'm in a business situation and the person across the table from me starts to yell or worse, cry. So that's what they really want. And so we help them learn ways of approaching these things and the actual words to use so that the reaction is a little bit more manageable.
You said it well. It's a skill set. You know, you learn that. You said you normalize conflict, because let's take an example. I mean, here in France, you know, conflict in France means like people yelling and screaming and things like this is what you picture. But if you say that you can do this skillfully, right? And I think this is very important. Like, you don't have this emotion burst that we always picture. You let your truth go, but in skillful way. Am I correct?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's very funny because there's a lot of smart French people working here in North America, and often this will happen. There'll be some kind of emotional outburst, and
like this.
And then all you have to say is you go, "I'm French." Right? And it's like, oh, okay.
We understand now.
It's very funny. So I always say, yes, you are French, thank you for Paris. Now, can we actually learn how to say this in a way that, because in the end, when you slow people down a bit, you say, did that work for you? Did freaking out and yelling in that person get them to change their opinion? Probably not. Did it get them to help you faster on that project of yours that's so important? No, it probably caused them to go, I'm actually going to put that a few down the list now, It's like when somebody drives up right behind me and, flashes their lights. I always slow down. I'm like, oh, yeah? So often we'll say to people in any of those three categories, so either the person who avoids conflict and you say, how's that working for you? Or the passive aggressive person who's just bitter all the time and nothing ever changes because they've never complained about something in a forum where it could change for the better. But also for that style where it's disinhibited and I'll say what I want and I'm speaking truth, but they do it in a very callous way. Yeah. In any of those cases, the question is it working? Is it making your business more effective? Is it making your experience of working on this team pleasant? And if not, maybe it's worth learning how to approach conflict as opposed to avoiding it, and B, when you approach it, do it skillfully, not with a sword, so that you actually can, get the outcomes you're looking for.
I'm sure the work that you do with those teams affects their personal life positively as well, because it is, conflict in your personal life or business. I think we deal with it the same way in both those parts of our lives, don't we? You're saving marriages, Liane.
Yeah. So the originating story, 2007, to why I started doing a lot more team effectiveness work was an executive team. The CEO had called me and he really soft-shoed the story of the team. He's like, well, it's not great, and I think we need a little help. And so I sent him out the materials on a program that we used to have called Team Inoculation, which we lovingly called the flu shot for teams. It was a program for new teams where you sort of immunize them against some of the common dysfunctions. I sent that out to him and he phones me back and he goes, I only have one question for you. I got the stuff you sent on the flu shot. And he kind of goes quiet for a second. Then he says, do you have a rabies shot? So I started working with his team. The first thing that I noticed is that their revenue had declined 3 years in a row. The tension and conflict on the executive team was having a huge business impact. Second, they used to be on the top 50 best employers list, and they fell right off that list. But the third was actually their COO, who had 7 kids and who finally at some point was in tears saying, I go home exhausted with no energy. I'm crabby to my kids, right? And it was actually that third piece that made me say, okay, we have got to change the quality of teams, because it's not just bad for our economy, It's not just bad for our employees. It's having this horrible ripple effect on families. So the one technique that we teach a lot is the most important strategy in conflict is validation. So if you're about to disagree with someone, the absolute best possible thing you can do is validate what they said. And that's kind of what the two truths is about. So if the person says to you, I think we need to spend our entire budget on sales training, what you want to say is, are you kidding me? Again? But if you have the presence to stop and go, okay, so what's really important to you is sales training. You think that that's where we're going to get the most bang for our buck. You think that's our highest priority. And then you say, I was really thinking that marketing was going to get a bigger impact, a bigger ROI. It is the exact same position. You have changed nothing, but you validated that person's perspective. You caused them, they were probably expecting you to go like, are you kidding me? And what you did is you went, I hear you.
Yeah.
And maybe you even went one notch further and like, tell me a little bit about what leverage you think we'll get from doing sales training. If you really stopped to validate them, and then you still said exactly what you were going to say before, which is probably not what would happen because as you listen to them, you probably will evolve. But even if you said exactly what you said before. So I teach this validation technique, and it's really helpful in conflict. I have many people come back for the next session and say, I tried it on my wife. It works great. And of course, what they'll say is, I walk in the door and, imagine my wife, works in the home, is raising our kids right now. And I walk through the door and she's like, oh my God, I had such a day. Jean-Francois forgot his lunch and, I had to do that and this and the dishwasher broke and, you're getting all this story. And your first reaction is to be like, yeah, well, I got called into the VP's office and pushed out. And a lot of people have come back and said, oh, yeah, that actually works. Thanks. And so it's very true. All of these things work in all domains. It works if you're on the school committee or you're, whatever. So if we could all learn how to have conflict more effectively, we would be in much better shape.
It's brilliant because you recognize the other, really. You don't stay close, you open up, actually. You say, I see you, I hear you, which is so important,
When we make someone feel invalid, we make them feel irrelevant. And if we take the moment to make them feel heard and valued and valid, then we're going to have the same discussion, but it's going to be a discussion. It's not going to feel like conflict. And even if we do a lot of role plays with these exercises. And then I say at the end, how did that feel? And people will often say something to me like, oh yeah, but that doesn't count because that wasn't conflict. Like, okay, thank you for making the
You're expecting a slinging match, aren't they?
Exactly. Yeah, it doesn't count. That doesn't count, Liane.
You mentioned it with his story with the director who cried, actually, who said he's overworked. And I hear more and more, from companies, teams are working very, very, very hard towards like objectives which are very harsh now. It looks like everyone is working nonstop. I heard, like people burn out or there's some stress issues and stuff like that. What do you see in the teams, where you go, is it what you feel is going on? And is there any things that we can do about it?
I think it's a huge problem because the quality of our ideas is going down. So Netflix has a documentary series called Cooked. Okay. And it's by the famous author Michael Pollan. And if you haven't seen it, it's just one of the best series I've ever seen. And they have one about bread. And what he says is a human being could have all of the flour in the world and all of the water in the world. After a little while, they would die. They would starve to death. But if you mix the flour and the water and let it collect the yeast from air and cooked it, you could live off of bread for your entire life. Nothing but bread. And so the way I talk about it with the executives I work with is we are shoving our heads full of flour and water and starving because there's no air to let that actually bubble and rise and grow into something that is valuable. I'm really working hard with teams to create more space, to have more time where there's, an open space agenda for just conversation. And we've become so hooked on 10-minute agenda items and what's the output we need to get from this that we have no white space. So I think there's the business impact of the pace we're going at is very negative. I think there's, of course, then the human impact. So our resilience is extremely low.
Yeah.
So in that moment when somebody invalidates you or says something that you get very frustrated by or you feel is hurtful, the likelihood that that's going to turn to anger or tears is extremely high because our resilience is very, very low. I don't think I can teach a team to use conflict skills effectively if they have no gas in the tank. You have all the best, and it's like as a parent, right? I have the best intentions as a parent until that, my kids have been at a 4-day dance competition this weekend where we're getting home at 11 at night and leaving at 6:30 in the morning. And that's the moment when I know I'm going to lose my nut in front of my kids because my resilience is low. So it's the same on teams and with businesses. So it's interesting. I find at the executive level, executives tend to find hobbies and things outside of work as indulgences, as, it's so busy here, I can't afford to go cycling this weekend or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm trying to get them to change their language. It is so busy here. The stakes are so high. I can't afford not to go cycling this weekend. I can't afford not to have those 2 hours to just let the flour and water rise. Right? Turn into something nutritious for my business because you've put a week's worth of flour and water in there, but it's turned into nothing. You are starving until you get some air. So trying to create that language, it's so busy, I can't afford not to exercise. It's so, right? It's such a big change we're trying to create in our company. I can't afford not to sleep well. All those sorts of things. So trying to change the language so that people understand as a leader, you are letting down your company.
So I think it's the same on the flip side, isn't it? The people that are paying the leaders are not taking care of this asset that they're actually paying for. It doesn't become an asset after a while if you completely starve it.
Exactly. So, what are you doing? You understand every other asset you have that your accountants know how to gap account for and all those other things. You get that those are expensive. A company's never going to replace all the computers until we're sure that, we've got everything out of those. And we're so careful with what we do with the $1,000 computer. But we have these multi-million-dollar leaders that, oh, no, we're willing to beat the crap out of them. That, I have one executive I work with, and he's German. He's just fantastic. And they do a 2-day away day every quarter with their leadership team. And no matter what's happening, after lunch on day 2, they go for at least an hour walk. So the 14 of them set out wherever they are in any weather, because he's German. So there's no such thing as bad weather, only inappropriate clothing. So they set out anywhere. And you know what? It's really funny. We did one recently. We went for this long walk along the waterfront. And it's great because the 14 people sort of group and regroup into 2s and 3s, and they're talking about their family, and they're talking about their hobbies, and they're talking about their kids. But we came back, and the afternoon session was about carving $60 million out of the capital budget, which could be, there's conflict. And actually, they had it in such a civilized way because, first of all, they'd had some oxygen. And second of all, they connected with each other as a bunch of human beings who, are exactly like me and trying to do the best for this company, its customers, and its shareholders that they can. So really smart practices like that. I got an email this morning. One of my favorite emails to get is, we don't need you this quarter. And, my reaction to that is always, yay.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Once again, if you would like to support our show, please subscribe to our channel, like us, or share this episode on your social media. Merci